In 1943, in the occupied French city of Lyon, a German general woke up screaming. His skin was on fire, not from shrapnel or chemical burns, but from something far more insidious, something that had been sleeping in his bed with him all night long. Within 72 hours, 12 high-ranking officers of the Wehrmacht High Command were scratching themselves bloody, unable to focus on battle plans, unable to sit through strategic meetings, unable to command anything except their own tortured flesh. Military doctors were baffled. The infection spread like wildfire through the officer quarters, but nowhere else. Not among the enlisted men, not among the local collaborators. Only the generals, only the men who made the decisions. And the source of this biological nightmare was not a sophisticated Allied operation, not a covert team of saboteurs dropped by parachute in the dead of night, but a 41-year-old washerwoman named Marcel Petit, who handled their laundry every single day. This is the story they erased from the history books because it made the Third Reich look like fools, brought down not by bombs or bullets, but by bedsheets and a woman they never saw coming. Lyon in 1943 was a city suffocating under the iron grip of German occupation. The Gestapo headquarters loomed over Place Bellecour like a concrete tomb, and every morning the sound of boots on cobblestones reminded the French that they no longer owned their own streets. The resistance operated in the shadows, planting bombs, cutting communication lines, assassinating collaborators, but the cost was astronomical. For every German killed, 100 French civilians were executed in reprisal. The Nazis had turned terror into mathematics. Klaus Barbie, the butcher of Lyon, had perfected the art of collective punishment, and the city bled daily. But life somehow continued. Bakers still baked bread with whatever flour they could scrounge. Teachers still taught children in hushed classrooms, and laundresses still washed the blood and sweat and arrogance out of German uniforms because refusing meant a bullet to the back of the head. This was the world Marcel Petit inhabited every day, a world where survival meant bowing your head and keeping your hands busy, where heroism was a luxury reserved for the young and the reckless. Marcel was neither young nor reckless. She was a widow, her husband shot during the first month of occupation for the crime of owning a radio. She had 2 daughters hidden in the countryside with her sister, sent away before the deportations began, before the yellow stars appeared on neighborhood doors. She worked at the Grand Hôtel des Étrangers, which the Germans had commandeered and transformed into officer quarters for the High Command. Every morning at 5 she arrived through the service entrance, invisible as furniture, and collected baskets overflowing with soiled linens. Sheets stained with wine and sweat, pillowcases reeking of pomade and cigarette smoke, towels used by men who signed deportation orders over breakfast. She scrubbed and boiled and pressed, her hands raw from lye soap, her back aching from the weight of other people's filth. The officers never looked at her. To them she was part of the architecture, a necessary inconvenience, a French ghost haunting the edges of their stolen luxury. They never asked her name. They never wondered what she thought about while she folded their silk pajamas, and that invisibility, that complete disregard, was about to become their greatest mistake. The resistance cell in Lyon was desperate. Recent operations had failed spectacularly. 3 safe houses had been raided in a single week. Our planned assassination of a Gestapo colonel had ended with 5 resistants hanging from lampposts in front of the train station as a warning. The leadership knew they had a traitor somewhere in the network, someone feeding information directly to Barbie's interrogators. But more than that, they knew the generals were planning something catastrophic. Intelligence suggested a major sweep through the Croix-Rousse district, the silk-weaving neighborhood where resistance activity ran deepest. Thousands would be arrested, hundreds would be executed. The cell needed time. They needed chaos. They needed the High Command distracted, disorganized, unable to coordinate the operation with their usual German efficiency. But how do you stop an army when you have no weapons, no explosives, no way to get close to the men who give the orders? The answer walked through their door on a rainy Tuesday evening in October, carrying a basket of clean laundry on her hip. Marcel had been thinking about it for months, watching the officers at the hotel, studying their routines with the patience of someone who had nothing left to lose. She noticed how they trusted their environment completely, how they never inspected their rooms, never questioned their food, never suspected that the invisible servants around them might have minds and wills and hatreds burning hotter than any furnace. She had heard whispers from other members of the resistance network, coded conversations in the laundry room, desperate plans that always seemed to require explosives or weapons or courage she was not sure she possessed. But she had something else. She had access. She had their trust even if they did not know they were giving it. And she had a sister in the countryside who raised sheep and understood exactly what scabies mites could do to skin when given the right conditions to multiply. The plan formed slowly, carefully, like a stain spreading through white fabric. It was disgusting. It was humiliating. It was perfect. The beauty of scabies is that it does not kill, but it destroys dignity and focus with ruthless efficiency. The mites burrow under the skin and lay eggs, creating an allergic reaction that drives victims to madness, with itching that intensifies at night, exactly when the body should be resting. Victims scratch until they bleed, creating secondary infections. Sleep becomes impossible. Concentration evaporates. And the incubation period, that beautiful window between infection and symptoms, meant Marcel could contaminate every sheet, every pillowcase, every towel in the officer quarters before anyone realized they were under attack. Her sister provided the source, blankets deliberately exposed to infected sheep, and Marcel did the rest. She soaked the contaminated fabric in water, barely hot enough to preserve the mites but hot enough to fool inspection. She pressed the sheets with an iron set just below the temperature that would kill the parasites. She delivered them with the same bored efficiency she always had, and she waited. 3 days later, the first general started scratching. By the end of the week, the entire high command was infected, and Lyon's war was about to change forever. The first sign that something was catastrophically wrong came during a morning briefing on October 28, 1943. General Major Heinrich Müller, commander of the Lyon garrison, stood at the head of the conference table in the requisitioned ballroom of the Grand Hotel, presenting updated security protocols for the planned Croix Rousse operation. Halfway through his presentation, he paused, his hand moving unconsciously to his collar, then to his wrist, then, with visible effort to maintain composure, to his rib cage. The other officers noticed but said nothing, trained in the Prussian discipline of ignoring discomfort. But by the time Miller reached his conclusion, 3 other men at the table were shifting in their chairs, tugging at their uniforms, their faces tight with the effort of not scratching. Within 48 hours, the hotel's medical officer was overwhelmed with complaints, rashes spreading across torsos and limbs, unbearable itching that intensified after dark. Officers reported feeling as if insects were crawling beneath their skin, which was closer to the truth than any of them realized. The German response was exactly what Marcel had predicted: arrogance masquerading as logic. The medical staff initially blamed French soap, assuming the locals had used substandard or contaminated cleaning products as a form of petty sabotage. Marcel and the other laundry workers were interrogated, their supplies inspected, their methods scrutinized. She stood in the basement laundry room with her head bowed and her hands clasped, answering questions in broken German, playing the part of the frightened, simple-minded washerwoman who barely understood what was being asked of her. The Germans found nothing suspicious in her soaps or washing protocols. Everything appeared regulation. The infection, they concluded, must have come from outside the hotel, perhaps from a brothel the officers frequented or contaminated furniture in one of the commandeered homes. The investigation shifted away from the laundry entirely, and Marcel returned to her work invisible once again. But the itching did not stop, it intensified. Officers began appearing at morning formations, with faces drawn from sleepless nights, their dress uniforms wrinkled because they could not stand still long enough for proper inspection. By the second week of November, the situation had deteriorated from embarrassing to operationally critical. General Major Müller, who prided himself on his ability to maintain discipline under any circumstance, was found by his adjutant at 3 a.m, sitting in a bathtub filled with ice water, his skin covered in angry red welts and scratch marks that had drawn blood. He was not alone in his misery. 12 of the 15 high-ranking officers stationed at the Grand Hotel were infected, and the pattern was undeniable. Only those who slept in the hotel rooms were affected. Those who maintained private residences in requisitioned French estates remained perfectly healthy. The hotel itself had become a trap, a source of contamination that the German medical staff could neither identify nor eliminate. Theories multiplied. Perhaps the building's ventilation system was spreading some unknown pathogen. Perhaps French saboteurs had introduced a chemical agent into the walls. Perhaps, and this was whispered only in the most paranoid circles, the resistance had developed a new form of biological weapon. The impact on military operations was immediate and devastating. The planned sweep of Croix-Rousse, scheduled for November 15th, was postponed indefinitely. Officers who could not sleep, who could not sit through a 2-hour planning session without excusing themselves to scratch until they bled, could not coordinate a complex multi-district raid involving hundreds of soldiers and Gestapo agents. Intelligence reports went unread. Strategic meetings were cancelled or cut short. The entire command structure of Lyon's occupation force was paralyzed, not by bullets or bombs, but by microscopic parasites eating them alive from the inside out. And while the Germans tore apart their own headquarters looking for saboteurs and searched the city for imaginary biological weapons laboratories, the resistance moved with unprecedented freedom. Safe houses were relocated. Weapons caches were redistributed. Networks that had been on the verge of exposure disappeared into new identities and new neighborhoods. Marcel watched it all unfold with the same quiet efficiency she brought to her laundry work. She continued to arrive at 5 every morning, continued to collect the soiled linens, continued to wash and press and deliver them with the blank expression of someone who existed only to serve. But now every contaminated sheet she placed on a general's bed was a small victory. Every infected pillowcase, a tactical strike that cost nothing but her time and her nerve. The Germans never suspected her because they had never truly seen her. She was furniture. She was wallpaper. She was the invisible architecture of their comfortable occupation. And that blindness, that absolute certainty that a French washerwoman could never be a threat, was the weapon she wielded with devastating precision. The High Command was eating itself alive, and Marcel Petit was the one who had set the table. The resistance leadership did not learn about Marcel's operation until it had already succeeded beyond anyone's wildest calculations. She had told no one, not even her contact in the network, because secrecy was survival, and loose lips meant firing squads. But when the postponement of the Croix-Rousse raid was announced through whispered intelligence from a sympathetic clerk in the German administrative office, questions began circulating through the underground. How had the Germans lost their operational momentum so completely and so suddenly? Why were officers being rotated out of Lyon to military hospitals in Germany? Why had Klaus Barbie himself cancelled 3 interrogation sessions, something the butcher of Lyon never did unless circumstances were catastrophically beyond his control? The answers came through Marie-Claire Rousseau, another laundress at the Grand Hotel, who had watched Marcel's methodical contamination routine with growing understanding and quiet horror. Marie-Claire brought the story to her resistance contact during a dead-drop exchange behind the Basilica of Notre-Dame de Fourvière, and within 24 hours, Marcel was summoned to a midnight meeting in the cellar of a shuttered bookshop on Rue de la République. The cell leader, a former schoolteacher named Laurent Michaud, who had survived 2 Gestapo interrogations through sheer stubborn silence, stared at Marcel across a table lit by a single candle. He asked her to explain, step by step, exactly what she had done, and she did, her voice steady and emotionless, reciting the process like a recipe for soup. The contaminated blankets from her sister's farm, the careful temperature control during washing to preserve the mites, the systematic infection of every officer's sleeping quarters over a 3-week period, the calculated risk that German arrogance would prevent them from suspecting a lowly washerwoman. When she finished, the room was silent except for the distant sound of a patrol passing on the street above. Laurent looked at her with something between admiration and disbelief, and then he did something Marcel had not experienced since before the occupation. He stood, walked around the table, and shook her hand as an equal. The woman who had been invisible for 3 years was suddenly the most valuable asset the Lion resistance possessed. The strategic implications were staggering. With the High Command effectively paralyzed, the resistance could accelerate operations that had been on hold for months. Arms shipments from the British could be received and distributed without the usual level of German surveillance. Jewish families, waiting in safe houses for forged papers and escape routes, could be moved to the Spanish border with reduced risk of checkpoint inspections. Sabotage operations against railway infrastructure, previously too dangerous because of the inevitable reprisals, could now proceed because the Germans lacked the coordination to mount their usual brutal responses. Laurent and his leadership council developed a comprehensive plan to exploit the chaos Marcel had created, a 6-week window of opportunity before the Germans inevitably identified the source of the infection and implemented countermeasures. But they needed Marcel to maintain the contamination, to ensure that even as some officers were rotated out and replaced, the new arrivals would fall victim to the same invisible assault. Marcel agreed without hesitation, but she imposed one condition that revealed the steel core beneath her submissive exterior. She would continue her work alone, with no assistance, no supervision, and no interference from the cell. Her reasoning was brutally practical. If she were caught, if the Germans finally connected the infection to the laundry operation, she would be the only one arrested, the only one tortured, the only one executed. The resistance network would remain intact. Her daughters, hidden safely in the countryside, would not be implicated. The organization could continue fighting while she paid the price for her courage. Laurent tried to argue, offering her backup plans and escape routes, but Marcel cut him off with a look that had survived 3 years of German occupation. She had already made her peace with the possible consequences the moment she pressed the first contaminated sheet. She was not interested in rescue fantasies or heroic last stands. She was interested in results, in buying time for others to fight, in weaponizing her own invisibility until the Germans finally learned to see her. For the next 4 weeks, Marcel walked a tightrope between meticulous routine and calculated sabotage. She varied her contamination patterns to avoid detection, sometimes leaving rooms untouched for several days before reintroducing infected linens, creating an irregular infection cycle that baffled German medical investigators. She listened carefully to conversations between officers and cleaning staff, gathering intelligence about which commanders were being transferred and when, ensuring that fresh arrivals received the same warm welcome of contaminated bedding. She maintained her expression of dull servitude even as she mentally catalogued every piece of information that might be useful to the resistance. Troop movements mentioned in passing, security protocol changes discussed during breakfast, the mounting frustration in officers' voices as their unexplained affliction destroyed their professional effectiveness. And every evening, as she walked home through the occupied streets of Lyon, she carried with her the knowledge that she had done more damage to the Wehrmacht than a dozen bombing raids, armed only with laundry soap and sheep parasites. By mid-December 1943, the Grand Hôtel des Étrangers had become a place of genuine dread among German officers assigned to Lyon. New arrivals received warnings from their predecessors about the cursed building, whispered briefings about the mysterious affliction that seemed to infect everyone who slept there, regardless of rank or background. Some officers requested alternative accommodations, only to be denied by a bureaucracy that refused to acknowledge that a requisitioned French hotel could defeat the German military. The official position remained that the infection was a temporary medical anomaly, possibly related to seasonal allergies or stress-induced dermatitis, nothing that warranted the logistical nightmare of relocating the entire High Command. So they stayed, and they scratched, and they slowly lost their minds to sleep deprivation and relentless itching. The hotel's pharmacy was emptied of calamine lotion and antihistamines within days. Officers traded rumors about folk remedies, vinegar baths, sulfur ointments, even prayers to saints they no longer believed in. Nothing worked because the source renewed itself every single night, delivered fresh to their beds by a woman whose face they still could not remember. The turning point came not from German investigation, but from carelessness born of desperation. A Gestapo captain named Werner Hoffmann, driven to the edge of sanity by 6 weeks of interrupted sleep, began conducting his own unauthorized inquiry. Unlike his superiors, who focused on external threats and sabotage conspiracies, Hoffman applied the methodical paranoia that made the Gestapo so effective. He assumed the enemy was already inside, invisible, operating with access and familiarity. He started with the hotel staff, not through formal interrogation but through observation. He watched the kitchen workers, the cleaning crews, the laundry staff, looking for patterns, for behaviors that deviated from mindless routine. And on a frigid morning in late December, he noticed something that had been there all along, hidden in plain sight. Marcel Petit entered the officer quarters, carrying fresh linens, but before distributing them she paused in a storage closet for approximately 90 seconds, alone with the baskets. It was a tiny deviation, meaningless to anyone not consumed by suspicion. But to Hoffman it was a crack in the facade. He did not arrest her immediately. That would have been the crude approach, the method of thugs who valued confessions over comprehension. Instead, Hoffman instituted surveillance, assigning a French collaborator to pose as a new laundry assistant and shadow Marcel's every movement. Within 3 days, the collaborator reported the irregularity. Marcel was indeed pausing in the storage closet, ostensibly to reorganize linens. But the duration was inconsistent and the behavior unnecessary. Hoffman ordered a search of the closet and found nothing incriminating, no weapons, no coded messages, nothing except cleaning supplies and neatly folded sheets. But he was Gestapo, trained to see guilt in the absence of evidence, and he made a decision that would unravel everything. He ordered Marcel's room at her boarding house searched while she worked, a quiet operation conducted by plainclothes agents who tore through her few possessions looking for proof of resistance connections. They found letters from her sister in the countryside, innocent correspondence about farm life and the health of her daughters, but one letter mentioned sheep with skin infections and the difficulties of treating scabies in livestock. Hoffman was not a doctor, but he was thorough, and he brought the letter to the hotel's senior medical officer, a man who had spent 8 weeks failing to identify the source of the outbreak. The medical officer read the letter once, then again, his face draining of color as the implications crystallized. Scabies. The symptoms matched perfectly. The intense itching, the rash patterns, the nighttime intensification, the resistance to standard treatments. And if the infection was scabies, deliberately introduced through contaminated bedding, then the enemy was not some sophisticated resistance cell with access to chemical weapons. The enemy was a middle-aged washerwoman who had weaponized livestock parasites. The medical officer demanded immediate action. Quarantine all linens, inspect all laundry workers, arrest anyone with connections to farms or livestock. But Hoffman, demonstrating the cruel patience that defined his career, insisted on a different approach. Do not arrest Marcel yet, he argued. Watch her, follow her, discover her contacts, map her network, and then destroy the entire resistance cell in a single coordinated strike. The medical officer protested, desperate to stop the infection, but Hoffman pulled rank. The investigation would proceed his way. Marcel sensed the change before she understood it. The hotel atmosphere shifted, conversations stopped when she entered rooms, and the new laundry assistant asked too many questions, with too much false friendliness. She had survived 3 years of occupation by trusting her instincts, and those instincts now screamed danger with every breath. She could not risk contact with the resistance, could not send warnings through the usual channels, because surveillance meant anyone she approached would be marked for arrest. She had no proof she was compromised, only the crawling certainty that the invisibility she had relied upon was dissolving, that German eyes were finally learning to see her. And so she made the decision that would define her legacy. She would accelerate the operation, contaminate every piece of linen in the hotel one final time with maximum concentration, and then disappear before Hoffman could spring his trap. It was not heroism that drove her, but mathematics. If she was caught anyway, she might as well ensure the Germans paid the highest possible price for her capture. On the morning of December 23, 1943, Marcel Petit arrived at the Grand Hotel, carrying more than laundry baskets. Hidden beneath the clean linens were bundles wrapped in brown paper, packages her sister had delivered 3 days earlier, during a supposedly routine visit to Lyon's Christmas market. Inside those packages were blankets that had been exposed to the most severe scabies outbreak her sister's farm had ever experienced, fabric so saturated with mites that even brief contact guaranteed infection. Marcel had spent the previous night preparing her final assault with the precision of a general, planning a decisive battle. She knew the hotel's schedule down to the minute, when the officers departed for morning briefings, when the cleaning crews rotated floors, when the Gestapo surveillance teams changed shifts. She had a 4-hour window of opportunity, from 6 in the morning until 10, when she could move through the building with minimal observation. 4 hours to contaminate every bed, every towel, every piece of fabric that would touch German skin. 4 hours to ensure that even if they caught her tomorrow or next week, the damage would already be irreversible. She worked with methodical calm that bordered on meditation, moving from room to room on the 3rd floor where the highest-ranking officers slept, stripping beds and replacing sheets with contaminated linens that looked and smelled identical to the regular inventory. The mites were invisible to the naked eye, microscopic saboteurs that required no courage, no dramatic sacrifice, only contact and time. She paid special attention to pillowcases, knowing that officers pressed their faces against them for 8 hours each night, maximizing exposure to the most sensitive skin. She contaminated bath towels and robes, hand towels and washcloths, even the decorative throws on sitting room furniture. Every surface that might touch bare skin became a vector for infection. The new laundry assistant, the collaborator assigned to watch her, worked 2 floors below and saw nothing unusual in Marcel's routine. The Gestapo surveillance team, positioned in a commandeered apartment across the street, noted her arrival and continued their observation logs without alarm. She was still invisible, still beneath suspicion, a ghost moving through the architecture of occupation. By 9:30 that morning, Marcel had contaminated 47 rooms, including the personal quarters of General Major Müller and 3 Gestapo section chiefs. She returned the original linens to the laundry for washing, following her normal routine precisely, giving no indication that anything had changed. But everything had changed. The scale of contamination she had just introduced would create an epidemic that no German medical officer could contain or cure without completely evacuating the hotel and burning every piece of fabric inside it. The incubation period meant symptoms would not appear for 3 to 5 days, giving her just enough time to execute the second phase of her plan: disappearance. She had already sent word to her sister through a trusted courier, a widow who sold eggs at the market, and asked no questions. The message was simple: bring the girls to Lyon on December 26th, the day after Christmas, when German patrols would be reduced and travel checkpoints less rigorous. Marcel would meet them at the Perrache train station, and together they would board a southbound train using forged papers the resistance had provided. The destination was a village near the Spanish border where smugglers moved refugees across the Pyrenees for the right price. But Marcel had miscalculated one critical variable. Werner Hoffmann's patience had limits, and those limits were reached on December 23rd at 11:45 in the morning. The Gestapo captain had spent 2 weeks watching Marcel's movements, mapping her routine, waiting for her to lead him to resistance contacts that never materialized. She went to work, she went home, she occasionally visited the market or the church, but she met no one suspicious, passed no messages, exhibited no behavior that suggested coordination with an underground network. Hoffmann began to suspect that Marcel Petit was not part of a larger cell at all, that she had acted alone, a rogue operator driven by personal revenge rather than organized resistance. And if she was operating independently, then surveillance was pointless. There were no contacts to arrest, no network to destroy. There was only a washerwoman who had humiliated the Wehrmacht and needed to be made an example of before she could inflict further damage. Hoffmann made his decision and assembled an arrest team, 4 Gestapo agents in plain clothes, armed with pistols and under orders to take her alive for interrogation. They would wait until she left the hotel at the end of her shift, follow her to a quiet street, and take her without witnesses or drama. Marcel felt it the moment she stepped out of the Grand Hotel's service entrance at 2:15 that afternoon. The wrongness in the air, the weight of eyes that were no longer pretending to look elsewhere. She did not turn around, did not acknowledge the sensation, but her mind accelerated through possibilities with brutal clarity. They were coming for her today, perhaps within minutes. She could not return to her boarding house. It would be the first place they searched. She could not go to any known resistance safe house. Surveillance meant leading the Gestapo directly to people who had risked everything to fight. She had one advantage. She knew Lyon's streets better than any German, knew the alleys and courtyards and basement passages that locals used to avoid checkpoints. And she had one asset the Gestapo could not take from her. The contamination was already complete. Whether they arrested her now or tomorrow, whether they tortured her for names she would not give, or executed her in the basement of their headquarters, the damage was done. 47 rooms, hundreds of infected linens, an epidemic that would cripple the Lyon High Command for months. She had already won. Now she just needed to survive long enough to see her daughters one last time. Marcel walked at her normal pace through the December cold, her breath forming small clouds in the air, her worn coat pulled tight against the wind that swept down from the Fourvière hill. She did not run because running meant guilt, and guilt meant bullets before questions. Behind her, maintaining a distance of approximately 30 meters, the 4 Gestapo agents followed with the practiced casualness of men who had hunted human beings through city streets for years. They expected her to lead them somewhere useful, to panic and seek refuge with accomplices, to make the mistake that all amateurs eventually made when they realized the net was closing. But Marcel was not panicking. Her mind was ice, calculating distances and angles and possibilities, with the cold precision of someone who had already accepted the worst outcome. She turned left onto Rue de la Charité, a street she knew intimately from childhood, where her father had operated a small print shop before the war. 2 blocks ahead was the entrance to a passage, one of Lyon's famous covered walkways that connected streets through the interior of buildings, designed centuries ago for silk merchants to transport their goods protected from rain. The passage had 3 exits, and the Gestapo agents, unfamiliar with Lyon's labyrinthine architecture, would not know which one she would choose. She entered the passage at a steady walk, acknowledging the shopkeeper at the entrance with a small nod, a regular customer returning from work. The passage was dimly lit, its glass ceiling filtered with grime and age, the December afternoon barely penetrating the shadows. Marcel moved 40 meters into the tunnel and then did something the Gestapo did not anticipate. She stopped at a milliner's shop, one of 3 small businesses that operated within the passage, and stepped inside as if browsing for a hat. The shopkeeper, an elderly woman named Simone who had known Marcel's family for 30 years, looked up from her workbench with recognition and immediate understanding. She asked no questions, simply gestured toward the back room with a slight movement of her head. Marcel disappeared behind a curtain while Simone returned to shaping felt around a wooden mold, her hands steady, her expression blank. When the Gestapo agents entered the passage 60 seconds later, they found it nearly empty. An old woman working on hats, a young couple examining gloves in another shop, a delivery boy carrying packages. No middle-aged washerwoman in a worn grey coat. Hoffman himself arrived within 5 minutes, his face tight with controlled fury as his agents explained that the target had vanished somewhere in the passage. He ordered an immediate search of every shop, every storage room, every possible hiding place. But the passage's architecture worked against German efficiency. The building was old, constructed in the 1700s, and its interior was a maze of false walls, narrow staircases and forgotten storage spaces known only to those who had worked there for decades. Simone the milliner opened her back room for inspection, showing the agents nothing but fabric bolts and hat forms, and a window that overlooked an interior courtyard. The window was closed and locked from the inside. The agents searched anyway, overturning boxes and ripping through stored inventory, but found no evidence that anyone had recently passed through. What they did not see, because they did not know to look for it, was the hinged panel in the floor beneath a cabinet, a relic from resistance activities during the First World War, when the passage had been used to smuggle deserters and refugees. Simone had opened that panel the moment Marcel entered her shop, and Marcel had descended into darkness without hesitation. The tunnel beneath the passage was barely 1 meter high, forcing Marcel to crawl through accumulated dust and cobwebs and the smell of earth that had not seen daylight in decades. Her hands found stone and rotted wood, and somewhere in the blackness she heard water dripping, the underground streams that ran beneath Lyon and had given the city its strategic importance since Roman times. She crawled for what felt like hours, but was perhaps 15 minutes following the tunnel by touch and memory of stories her father had told about the old smuggling routes. The tunnel emerged in the basement of a building 2 streets away, a wine cellar that had been abandoned when its owner was arrested for black market activities in 1941. Marcel pushed through a wooden door that crumbled at her touch and found herself among broken barrels and shattered bottles. The air thick with the vinegar smell of wine turned to rot. She climbed a stone staircase to street level, emerging into an alley behind a butcher shop that had been closed for months, its windows boarded, its doors sealed with official German notices warning against trespassing. She was filthy, her coat covered in dust, her hands scraped and bleeding from the tunnel crawl, but she was free. For now. Marcel moved quickly through the alley system, staying away from main streets, heading toward the Saône River where the old tannery district offered dozens of abandoned buildings and hiding places. She needed 48 hours, 2 days to stay invisible while the Gestapo tore Lyon apart looking for her, 2 days until her sister arrived with her daughters at Parache Station, 2 days to survive before she could attempt the most dangerous part of her plan, escaping Lyon entirely, while every checkpoint and patrol in the city searched for a washerwoman who had committed the unforgivable crime of making the Wehrmacht scratch themselves bloody. Behind her, in the Grand Hôtel des Étrangers, 47 rooms waited in silence, their contaminated linens already spreading an epidemic that would, within 72 hours, force the complete evacuation of the officer quarters and the cancellation of every major German operation planned for the Lyon region through the end of January 1944. Marcel had won the battle. Now she just needed to survive the war long enough to see her victory matter. For 48 hours, Marcel Petit became a ghost haunting Lyon's forgotten spaces. She slept in the loft of an abandoned tannery where the stench of old chemicals kept even the homeless away. Wrapped in canvas tarps she found stacked in a corner, eating nothing because hunger was safer than risking exposure at a market or bakery. She had no access to news, no way to know if the Gestapo had connected her disappearance to the hotel contamination, or if they still believed she was simply a fleeing suspect in an unrelated sabotage investigation. But on the morning of December 25th, Christmas Day, 1943, Lyon awoke to chaos that confirmed her success beyond anything she had imagined. The Grand Hôtel des Étrangers had been evacuated during the night. Every officer, every staff member, every piece of furniture and fabric had been removed under emergency orders from the regional Wehrmacht Medical Command. Soldiers in decontamination suits scrubbed the building with lye and burned linens in the courtyard, while officers who could barely stand from exhaustion and infected skin were loaded into trucks and transported to military hospitals as far away as Stuttgart and Berlin. The scabies epidemic had reached critical mass, infecting not just the original targets, but spreading through contact to administrative staff, drivers, even the Gestapo agents who had searched officers' quarters looking for evidence of sabotage. The German response was totalitarian fury, amplified by humiliation. Klaus Barbie, the butcher of Lyon, issued orders that turned the city into a hunting ground. Every laundry worker in Lyon was arrested for interrogation. Every woman matching Marcel's general description was stopped at checkpoints and held for identification verification. Roadblocks appeared on every route out of the city, with special attention paid to trains heading south toward Vichy France and the Spanish border. Barbie personally supervised interrogations at Gestapo headquarters, applying his infamous techniques to anyone suspected of harboring information about the Washerwoman terrorist who had brought the Wehrmacht to its knees with bedsheets and parasites. 3 laundry workers died under torture, knowing nothing but suffering anyway because the Gestapo needed someone to blame. The resistance went to ground, cancelling all operations, burning safe house records because Barbie's rage made him unpredictable and even more dangerous than usual. The entire underground network held its breath and waited for the storm to pass. praying that Marcel Petit, wherever she was, had the sense to stay hidden until the city stopped bleeding. Marcel knew nothing of the chaos she had created as she made her way through pre-dawn darkness on December 26th toward Perrache station. She moved through service alleys and maintenance corridors, avoiding checkpoints by using the knowledge that came from a lifetime lived in Lyon's working-class neighborhoods. She had scrubbed the tunnel dirt from her face and hands using water from a public fountain, had stolen a different coat from a clothesline behind a boarding house, had transformed herself from the recognizable washerwoman into just another tired Frenchwoman struggling through occupation. The train station was dangerous, crawling with German military police and French collaborator patrols, but it was also her only chance. Her sister would arrive on the 8:15 from the countryside, bringing Marcel's daughters and the forged travel documents that would identify them as a family relocating to Marseille for factory work. If Marcel could reach them, if they could board the southbound train without inspection, they had a chance of reaching the Pyrenees crossing point before the Gestapo connected the fleeing family to the Hotel Saboteur. She entered Perrache station at 7:40, blending into the thin crowd of early morning travelers, mostly workers and peasants bringing goods to the city markets. The German presence was overwhelming. Soldiers at every entrance, officers inspecting papers at the platforms, plainclothes Gestapo agents watching the crowds with predatory attention. Marcel kept her head down, her posture submissive, her movements those of someone exhausted by labor and war and the weight of survival. She found a bench near platform 4 where she could watch the arrivals board without being directly in the flow of traffic. Her heart hammered against her ribs, her hands shook despite her efforts at calm, because she knew the odds were catastrophically against her. If the Gestapo had distributed her photograph, if any of these agents recognized her face, she would be arrested before she could reach her children. And if she was arrested here, in the station, her daughters would witness their mother's capture, would be taken themselves for interrogation about what they knew, would pay the price for her courage with their own suffering. At 8:17, 2 minutes behind schedule, the countryside train arrived in a hiss of steam and screaming brakes. Passengers disembarked in the shuffling mass of rural French coming to Lyon for supplies or work, or desperate attempts to find food in a city that had little enough for its own residents. Marcel scanned faces with an intensity that bordered on physical pain, looking for her sister's familiar features, for her daughters who she had not seen in 8 months, who might have grown or changed beyond her recognition. And then she saw them, Claudette and Sophie, 9 and 7 years old, holding their aunt's hands, wearing clean but patched dresses, their faces solemn with the premature seriousness that war forced on children. They looked so small, so fragile, so utterly unprepared for the violence that surrounded them. Marcel stood, every instinct screaming to run to them, to hold them, to whisper that everything would be safe now. But safety was an illusion, and running toward them meant drawing attention, meant German eyes following her movement and recognizing the washerwoman terrorist embracing children in a train station. So she waited, frozen between maternal love and tactical necessity, watching as her sister guided the girls toward the platform exit, praying that 20 more steps would bring them close enough for reunion without discovery. Marcel's sister Anne-Marie saw her first. Their eyes met across 15 meters of crowded platform, and in that instant of recognition, Anne-Marie's face betrayed nothing, no joy, no relief, no acknowledgement beyond the briefest flicker of understanding. She had survived 3 years in the countryside by learning the same lessons Marcel had mastered in the city. Emotion was dangerous, recognition was lethal, and survival required the ability to pretend that the person you loved most in the world was a stranger. Anne-Marie guided the girls toward the exit with deliberate casualness, pausing to adjust Sophie's collar, buying time for Marcel to position herself near the newspaper kiosk where they could converge without appearing to have planned the meeting. The girls looked tired, their faces showing the strain of early morning travel and the tension that radiated from their aunt's carefully controlled movements. Claudette, the older daughter, scanned the crowd with intelligent eyes that suggested she understood more about their situation than anyone wanted to believe. When her gaze passed over Marcel, there was a microsecond of hesitation, a fragment of recognition suppressed with admirable discipline for a 9-year-old child who had not seen her mother in 8 months. The convergence happened near the station's main exit, where passengers bottlenecked through a checkpoint manned by 2 German soldiers and a French policeman who checked identity papers with the enthusiasm of someone who hated his job but needed the paycheck. Marcel fell into step behind her sister and daughters, maintaining a stranger's distance, watching as Anne-Marie presented travel documents for inspection. The papers were good. Resistance forgeries that identified Anne-Marie and the girls as the Dubois family from a village near Chalon-sur-Saône, traveling to Marseille, where Anne-Marie had supposedly secured employment at a textile factory. The German soldier barely glanced at the documents, his attention focused on a commotion at another checkpoint where an old man was arguing about confiscated sausages. He waved Anne-Marie through with disinterest, and Marcel's heart surged with desperate hope. 3 more people ahead of her. 2, 1. Then her turn, presenting papers that identified her as Geneviève Laurent, widow, factory worker, traveling alone to Marseille for the same employment opportunity. The soldier took her papers, and this time, because randomness is the cruelest mathematics of survival, he actually looked at her face. For 3 seconds that stretched into eternity, Marcel stared back at the German soldier, with the blank expression of someone who had spent years being invisible. She saw him comparing her features to some internal catalogue of wanted faces, saw the uncertainty in his eyes, the question forming about why this woman seemed familiar, even though he could not place where he had seen her before. The soldier had never been to the Grand Hôtel des Étrangers, had never walked past Marcel in its corridors, but he had seen the photograph that Gestapo headquarters had distributed to every checkpoint in Lyon. A grainy image of a woman in a laundry worker's uniform, unremarkable except for the notation in red ink that she was wanted for sabotage and terrorist activities. The soldier's hand moved toward the whistle hanging from his belt, the signal that would bring officers and questions and the end of everything. But before he could raise it to his lips, the commotion at the other checkpoint escalated into shouting. The old man with the sausages apparently refusing to surrender his contraband, and the soldier's attention fractured between the woman in front of him and the disturbance requiring intervention. He made a choice, the wrong choice from the Gestapo's perspective, but the choice that saved Marcel's life. He thrust her papers back at her with an irritated gesture and turned toward the shouting. Marcel walked through the checkpoint with legs that threatened to collapse beneath her, every step requiring conscious effort to maintain the appearance of normalcy. She did not look back, did not acknowledge Anne-Marie and the girls who had passed through moments earlier, simply walked across the station's main hall toward Platform 7, where the southbound train to Marseille waited with steam hissing from its undercarriage. She found a third-class car near the rear, entered, and sat in a wooden bench seat worn smooth by years of desperate travelers. 2 minutes later, Anne-Marie and the girls entered the same car from the opposite end, settling into seats 4 rows ahead, still maintaining the fiction of strangers sharing a train. The station clock showed 8:42. The train was scheduled to depart at 8:50. 8 minutes to sit in silence while German patrols walked the platforms, while Gestapo agents made final checks of passenger manifests, while the entire machinery of occupation had 8 minutes to discover that the most wanted woman in Lyon was sitting in a third-class railway car, pretending to read a 2-day-old newspaper she had found abandoned on the seat. At 8:49, a Gestapo officer in a long leather coat entered the railway car and began walking down the aisle, checking faces against a photograph he held in his hand. Marcel saw him in her peripheral vision and knew with absolute certainty that this was the end, that God or fate or random chance had given her freedom only to snatch it away at the final moment. She could see her daughters' heads 4 rows ahead, could see Claudette turning to look at the Gestapo officer with a child's curiosity about the man in the dramatic coat. The officer was 3 rows away, 2 rows, 1. He stopped directly beside Marcel's seat, and she looked up from her newspaper into eyes that had seen too much suffering and inflicted more, eyes that were comparing her face to the photograph in his hand. His mouth opened to speak, and then the train lurched forward with a mechanical scream, the 8:50 departure executed with Swiss precision despite French railways operating under German control, and the sudden movement threw the Gestapo officer off balance. He grabbed the seat back to steady himself, and in that moment of distraction, Marcel saw him make the same calculation the checkpoint soldier had made. Was this woman worth the trouble of stopping a departing train? He looked at her one more time, his expression unreadable, and then he moved on, walking toward the next car as the train gathered speed and Lyon began to fall away outside the windows. The train rolled south through the winter countryside of Vichy, France, passing frozen fields and villages that looked abandoned even when smoke rose from chimneys, the landscape itself exhausted by occupation and collaboration and the moral compromise of survival. Marcel sat motionless in her seat for the first hour, hands folded in her lap, newspaper forgotten, her mind refusing to accept that she had actually escaped Lyon until the city disappeared completely behind hills and distance. Only when the train crossed into the department of Ardèche did she allow herself to breathe normally, to acknowledge that the immediate danger had passed, even though dozens of checkpoints and patrols still waited between her and the Spanish border. Anne-Marie maintained the pretense of separation for another 30 minutes, before finally moving back through the car with Sophie in tow, sitting down beside Marcel with the casual manner of strangers making conversation to pass time. Claudette remained in the forward seat, positioned to watch for anyone approaching from that direction, a 9-year-old sentry who understood without being told that her family's survival depended on vigilance. When Sophie saw her mother up close for the first time in 8 months, tears filled her eyes, but Anne-Marie's hand on her shoulder was both comfort and warning. Cry silently, or not at all, because sound carried, and Germans rode these trains too. They spoke in whispers, leaning close like gossips sharing secrets, reconstructing 8 months of separation in fragments. Anne-Marie explained how the girls had adapted to farm life, how they had learned to collect eggs and feed chickens, and never ever mention their real names or ask about their mother in front of strangers. Marcel listened to stories about Sophie's fear of the rooster and Claudette's skill at arithmetic, and the kindness of neighbors who suspected the girls were refugees but asked no questions, because asking meant responsibility. In return, Marcel told them nothing about the hotel, nothing about contaminated linens or Gestapo surveillance or tunnels beneath Lyon's streets. She simply said she had been working and saving money, and now they were going somewhere safer, somewhere the war might not reach them, and if the girls understood this was a beautiful lie told by adults who had no idea what tomorrow would bring, they accepted it with the grace of children who had learned that truth was a luxury reserved for peacetime. The train rattled on through the afternoon, stopping at small stations where French police inspected papers, with the bored efficiency of men who had performed the same ritual 1,000 times. Each inspection was a small terror, but the resistance documents held, and the inspectors saw only what the papers told them to see: a widow and her sister traveling with 2 nieces to find factory work in the south. They reached Marseille at dusk on December 27th, the city sprawling and chaotic under occupation that was somehow both more relaxed and more desperate than Lyon's. The port was controlled by Germans and Italians who spent more time fighting each other for administrative authority than hunting resistance fighters, and the resulting bureaucratic confusion created gaps that smugglers and refugees exploited with practiced efficiency. Anne-Marie had memorized an address on Rue de la République, where a fishing boat captain named Marcel operated a network that moved people across the Mediterranean to North Africa, or, for those willing to risk the mountain crossing, guided them to Spanish border towns where Republican sympathizers hid refugees from Franco's police. The price was steep, 10,000 francs per person, money that represented the sale of Anne-Marie's farm animals and every piece of jewelry Marcel's family had owned. They would arrive in Spain as paupers, if they arrived at all, but poverty was survival, and survival was victory. They found Marcel's apartment above a fish market that reeked of brine and rot, and when he opened the door he took one look at Marcel's face and shook his head with something between admiration and disbelief. Marcel had heard about the washerwoman who had paralyzed the Lyon High Command with contaminated bedsheets. The story had spread through the resistance network like fire through dry grass, growing in the telling until Marcel had become a legend, a ghost who had struck at the heart of German power and vanished without a trace. But the woman standing in his doorway did not look like a legend. She looked like every exhausted mother he had ever helped escape, thin and frightened and desperate to save her children from a war that devoured innocence with mechanical efficiency. He quoted his price, watched Marcel's sister count out carefully saved francs with shaking hands, and then told them the truth that smugglers rarely shared. The mountain crossing in winter was suicide for children, the snow too deep, the cold too severe, the patrols too vigilant. But he knew a freighter captain who owed him favors, a man who moved cargo between Marseille and Oran in Algeria, and for an additional 2,000 francs, he could arrange passage for a widow and her family hidden in a shipping container among medical supplies destined for Free French forces in North Africa. From Oran they could make their way to Casablanca, and from Casablanca they could eventually reach Gibraltar and perhaps, if luck and Allied victories aligned, passage to England or even America. It was a fantasy built on hope and money they did not have, but Anne-Marie produced her last hidden treasure, a diamond ring that had belonged to their grandmother, worth far more than 2,000 francs. Marcel took it without haggling and promised them space on a freighter departing January 2nd, 1944. They spent 5 days in a safe house near the old port, a cramped apartment above a bakery where 8 other refugees waited for their own escape routes to materialize. Marcel shared a mattress with her daughters, holding them through the nights when bombing raids sent everyone into the basement, telling them stories about the life they would build after the war, stories that existed only in her imagination, but felt more real than the present. On New Year's Day, 1944, she allowed herself to believe they might actually survive. And on January 2nd, as they walked through the pre-dawn darkness toward the docks, she thought about the Grand Hôtel des Étrangers in Lyon, about the officers who were still scratching their infected skin in hospitals across Germany, about the operations that had been cancelled and the lives that had been saved because a washerwoman had chosen to fight with the only weapons she possessed: access, invisibility, and livestock parasites. She had struck her blow. The war would continue without her. But she had proven that power was vulnerable, that the Wehrmacht could be brought to its knees by a woman they never learned to see, and that victory did not always require guns or bombs or the courage of young men willing to die. Sometimes victory required the quiet fury of a mother who refused to let occupation define her surrender. Marcel Petit and her daughters reached Oran, Algeria, on January 9th, 1944, smuggled in a shipping container that reeked of diesel fuel and medicine, bruised and dehydrated, but alive. From there, the trail goes cold in the way that so many refugee stories do, lost in the bureaucratic chaos of Free French territories and Allied military operations that had no time to document the survival of individual families. Some records suggest she worked as a laundress in an Allied field hospital near Algiers, her skills needed even in exile, her hands continuing to wash away blood and dirt while armies fought across North Africa and then into Italy. Other fragments indicate she may have reached Casablanca by late 1944, living in a refugee camp where thousands waited for visas that rarely came, teaching her daughters to read and write in a tent city built from canvas and desperation. What is certain is that Marcel never returned to France during the war, never saw Lyon liberated in September 1944, when American and Free French forces swept the Germans out of the city she had fought in her own quiet way. She became what she had always been, invisible, a footnote to history, a woman whose name appears in no official records of resistance activities and whose contribution to the war effort was deliberately erased because admitting that a washerwoman had crippled the Wehrmacht was too embarrassing for all parties involved. But in Lyon, among the survivors who rebuilt their shattered city after liberation, stories circulated. The laundry workers who had been tortured by the Gestapo and survived whispered about Marcel Petit, the one who got away, the one who made the Germans scratch until they bled. Resistance fighters who had benefited from the chaos she created, who had moved weapons and refugees and intelligence through a city distracted by a scabies epidemic, raised glasses in quiet bars to the woman who weaponized bedsheets. And in the archives of German military hospitals, buried in medical reports that were captured after the war and filed away in Allied intelligence repositories, there are records of a mysterious scabies outbreak in Lyon during the winter of 1943 to 44 that infected 43 high-ranking officers, caused the evacuation of military headquarters, and resulted in the cancellation or postponement of 17 major operations. Canes including a planned sweep of the Croix-Rousse district that would have resulted in the arrest and execution of over 200 resistance members and Jewish families in hiding. Those operations were never rescheduled because by the time the infection was finally contained, the strategic situation had shifted, and Lyon's importance to the German war effort had diminished as Allied forces advanced from the south and east. Marcel's epidemic had bought time, and time had bought lives, even if no one could calculate exactly how many. The official histories of World War II resistance movements focus on armed fighters, saboteurs who blew up railways, spies who stole secrets, and brave men who died in dramatic last stands against overwhelming force. There is no monument in Lyon to Marcel Petit, no street bearing her name, no plaque commemorating the washerwoman who turned laundry into warfare. The French government never awarded her a medal because there is no record of her actions in the files they used to determine who deserved recognition after liberation. The British and Americans, who meticulously documented resistance activities in occupied Europe, have no reports about a scabies epidemic because such an unglamorous, almost comical form of sabotage did not fit the heroic narrative they wanted to tell about the underground war against fascism. And so Marcel disappeared from history twice, first when she fled Lyon in December 1943, and again when the war ended and no one thought to ask what happened to the woman who made German generals scratch themselves bloody. But her story survived in the oral tradition of Lyon's working-class neighborhoods, passed down through families who remembered, embellished perhaps, but fundamentally true in the ways that matter most. What Marcel Petit understood, and what makes her story so crucial today, is that resistance does not always look like heroism in the Hollywood sense. It does not always require dramatic sacrifice or military precision or the kind of courage that gets you killed in a blaze of glory. Sometimes resistance is simply refusing to accept that invisibility equals powerlessness, that being overlooked means being harmless, that the people who clean and cook and wash and serve are incapable of fighting back. She saw the weapon that existed in her access to German vulnerability, in the intimacy of handling the linens where powerful men slept, and she used it with devastating effectiveness. She proved that you do not need guns to immobilize an army, that biological warfare can be as simple as livestock parasites and careful contamination, and that the most dangerous enemy is often the one you trained yourself not to see. In an era when we are constantly told that individual actions do not matter, that systemic power is too entrenched to challenge, that ordinary people should leave fighting to professionals and heroes, Marcel's story is a reminder that power always has weaknesses, and those weaknesses are often most visible to the people power dismisses as irrelevant. The reason you have never heard this story, the reason Marcel Petit's name does not appear in textbooks alongside more celebrated resistance fighters, is not because it is unimportant or unverified, but because it is deeply uncomfortable for institutions that prefer their heroes to look a certain way, to fight with approved weapons, to fit narratives that glorify violence and minimize the contributions of women, workers, and people who survive. D rather than died dramatically. Marcel's victory was too strange, too unglamorous, too dependent on intimate knowledge of laundry and parasites and the rhythms of hotel housekeeping. It made the Wehrmacht look foolish, but it also challenged the assumption that war is won only by soldiers and spies, that resistance requires youth and physical strength and access to explosives. She was 41 years old, exhausted, grieving, and completely unremarkable to everyone who saw her. And she brought an entire military command structure to its knees, using nothing but the tools of her ordinary life, turned to extraordinary purpose. That is the story they did not want you to know, because if one washerwoman could do that in 1943 Lyon, what could thousands of overlooked, underestimated, invisible people do today if they decided that their ordinary access to power's vulnerabilities was actually a weapon waiting to be used? Marcel Petit answered that question with contaminated bedsheets and disappeared into history before anyone could stop her, leaving behind only the itch that German generals could not scratch away, and a lesson that terrifies every comfortable authority. The people you do not see are the ones you should fear most.